everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be discussing a blog post called The Relativity of Time, written by Seth Godin. Another blog post titled The Rise of the Solopreneur and 4 Tips for Success, written on the Under 30 CEO blog, as well as another blog post or keynote which Brian Solis actually did, titled Imagining a New Era of Restaurant Experiences by Reinventing the Restaurant Industry. So let's go. Okay, so we're starting off with the Relativity of Time blog post, and again, it's really short and sweet. It's written by Seth Godin, and his blog posts are generally really short. So I would really recommend you guys go and check it out. Link in the description, again, as always. So here goes. The relativity of time. 2 things are true simultaneously. We're running out of time. We have too much time on our hands. How can we be at a deadline and bored at the same time? We always are. Our experience of time relates to engagement, fear, opportunity, and the culture. So when I read this blog post, it kind of made me think a lot about what time actually is and just the concept of time, which in itself are some really meta thoughts. But I kind of realized that we see time, or especially being a science student, we see time as kind of this really objective thing, but then at the same time this really subjective thing, which is really the side that's being highlighted in this blog post. So for us, when we do scientific experiments, for example, oftentimes time is that variable that we measure in order to then create empirical theories or scientific explorations. And in that case, time is really this kind of objective unit of measurement which we base all of these theories on. And on the other hand, as is highlighted in this blog post, time is this thing which is really hard to actually explain and super relative, and we often feel like we have too much, too little, and it just seems like this really, really abstract kind of concept. And I just find it interesting how time is really both these 2 things at once. Okay, moving on to the blog post titled Rise of the Solopreneur. And like you, probably, maybe you know what it is, but I had no clue what a solopreneur was when I first read this. And essentially, a solopreneur is an entrepreneur who prefers the freedom to run a business on their own and without any W-2 employees. This blog post really goes through, it says 4 tips for successful solopreneurship. So they basically highlight these 4 kind of tips to get you started as a solopreneur. And the 4 tips are: let your mind go there, stack your skills, network like crazy, progress over perfection. And some of these are pretty kind of obvious, I found at least, but I do want to highlight a couple of them. And one of them is the let your mind go there. So often when it comes to entrepreneurship or just businesses in general, or just starting any projects, you're always told to kind of stop yourself from thinking about the worst case and not worry too much, and just really plan ahead and focus on the kind of goal that you have in mind. But what this blog post actually says is that you shouldn't stop yourself from thinking about the worst case scenario and just let your mind go there. And after you kind of thought about this worst case, just take that to heart and realize that in the end it might not actually be that bad. The world continues, and if you get to that point for whatever reason, you can reroute, and by actually matching the worst case scenario, you'll be prepared to notice it when you're actually about to slip into it, which will make that rerouting easier. Another thing that I found interesting from this blog post is actually that the network like crazy point, which again might seem kind of obvious, but it's something I talked about in the video I made about how I actually ended up becoming a founding engineer of a startup. Go check that out if you haven't seen that already. But they highlight the importance of networking, and there's this saying which is it's not what you know, but who you know. And I feel like that really applies here, and just in business in general, but especially if you are a solopreneur, since everything is kind of relying on you. Having that connections and having that kind of network really gives you a support network and people that you can ask for advice. The 3rd point I actually want to highlight out of these 4, I guess most of them were kind of pretty interesting to me, is the progress over perfection point. And I always kind of saw myself as a perfectionist, but they really highlight how action is more important than perfection, because often when you are a perfectionist, and I definitely realize this, is that you end up planning and planning and planning, and you want to plan so much to get that perfect outcome, which is unrealistic to begin with. And then you get to the point where your planning leads to paralysis and you don't actually end up taking any action. So you spend all this time planning in the hopes for this perfect outcome, and your end outcome is no outcome at all. And that is definitely not the outcome that you were hoping for. So yeah, action and just taking small steps, and then iterating on those steps is much more important than just aiming for the perfect outcome from the get-go. Okay, and now coming to the last content for today, which is this keynote slash again blog post by Brian Solis. And he talked about the future of restaurants, but he also, like, one of the main takeaways I had was actually how he defined innovation and iteration. So he said that we look into the future based on the knowledge that we have of the present, which, yeah, most of us do, and that's kind of what we're used to doing when thinking about the future. And that is what he calls iteration, because you're doing something that you're doing in the present, but you're gonna do it better in the future, and that's iteration. And what he says is necessary for innovation is actually not looking into the future based on our current knowledge of the present, but just reinventing the future completely. And that's actually, rather than doing the same but better, it's doing something completely new, and that's actual innovation. So he was having this keynote in front of like a panel of people that kind of work with or are somehow connected to restaurants. I don't know, I like food, that's why I read this blog post, to be honest. And he said that he asked the people to think of a restaurant. I want you to do the same here. Think of a restaurant, and you're probably thinking of a room with tables, seats, and food. And he said that that's kind of the current vision or current model of a restaurant. But what is actually the definition of a restaurant? And that's kind of harder to actually define than you might think, because a restaurant essentially is just a place where you can get food, right? They have these kiosks at McDonald's now where you don't actually need to sit down. You can walk in, you can order, you don't even speak to a person, you get food and you walk out. And that counts as a restaurant. So there's no tables, no chairs. And what if restaurants in the future moved away from this, what he called butt in seats model, and moved towards a food in bellies model, which essentially means that what if in the future restaurants wouldn't even need physical spaces anymore? And one of the reasons actually why I did read this blog post and why it was written is because of this whole current like COVID situation, where people are generally way more cautious when it comes to physical contact and physical spaces. So this is definitely a direction that things could be heading in. So those are all the pieces of content for today. Before I do end this video, I just want to say there's some exciting stuff coming up for the channel. Next Monday, I'm actually going to be posting my first kind of collab video, which is super exciting. And then, because I am going to be heading back home to Austria soon, I'm actually going to also be releasing a kind of travel video about that whole experience. So stay tuned for those two things. And then on top of that, I'm actually going to be getting a camera upgrade soon once I'm actually back home. So that then hopefully everything that you see now is going to look just a tad bit better than it does now. But yeah, as always, if you guys like what you've seen in this video or found it useful in any way, shape, or form, leave a like, subscribe to stay tuned for those channel updates and everything that's planned, and that collab, and also the future of this series, and hit the notification bell to be notified. And yeah, as always, take care, and I'll see you soon.